The late 1980s was a time of great strides in American culture, but these good times were coming to an end. The presidency of Ronald Reagan had just ended in January of 1989, when, after 15 years of near peace in the Atlantic Ocean, it suddenly and brutally snapped. In September 1989, a tropical wave that moved off of Africa began to develop, and what would become of it would bring much of the Caribbean to its knees. But it did not stop there. As this beast restrengthened into a Category 4 hurricane with winds of 140 miles per hour, it would make landfall near the city of Charleston, South Carolina, and would completely obliterate the great city. For the first time in 20 years, communities were completely leveled, and over 2/3 of South Carolina was crushed by this beast's winds in fast motion. This hurricane would be the first, if not one of, the first well-documented storms of the modern meteorological era, with hurricane hunters flying in every 2 hours to investigate and inform tens of millions of people of its path. This hurricane would be both the worst and best thing to happen to Charleston. This titan was Hurricane Hugo, and those in the Charleston area still tremble when you mention it. To first understand how Hurricane Hugo happened, we must first address the conditions that were in place when this happened, as this would be the start of a precedent that is still ongoing today. 1989 was a passive year for tropical storms, let alone hurricanes. Only 11 names were used, but of those, 7 became hurricanes, a surprisingly high hurricane-to-name ratio. Even as the season had 7 hurricanes, most either stayed out to sea or made landfall as Category 1 hurricanes. Another thing to note was the late 1980s. The 1980s in American culture was arguably the strongest and best decade to be around. Ronald Reagan had led the country through prosperity, and the Cold War was finally dying down. And things only seemed to continue after Reagan was succeeded by his own vice president, George Bush Sr. And for the first few months, it did, and things seemed better than ever. However, as early September came around, an event would swirl around to give America and her territories a reality check, as well as the birth of this statement: it only takes one. On September 9th, 1989, a tropical wave moved off the coast of Africa. Seems typical enough, but then it starts organizing at a very alarming pace. This wave would become Tropical Depression 11 the next day, and then Tropical Storm Hugo less than 24 hours later. After such a rise of a system that would rock the American dream in the coming days, it stopped strengthening to consolidate. This process took all day on September 11th, and on September 12th, it began to strengthen again. On September 13th, 1989, Hugo became a hurricane 1,100 miles east of the Leeward Islands. After this, Hugo rapidly intensified. Not much is known of its rapid intensification, but what we do know is the result. On September 15th, at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 1800 UTC, the first hurricane reconnaissance aircraft arrived in the center of Hugo. But what they found was winds of over 160 miles per hour, making it a Category 5 hurricane, a titan like many before and after. Although satellite was in its infancy, we could still see that Hugo's structure was very impressive. It was nearly symmetrical and had few imperfections. However, this peak intensity was short-lived, as Hugo weakened slightly back down to a Category 4 strength as it approached the Lesser Antilles, with hurricane warnings issued for St. Lucia all the way up to the British Virgin Islands. Hugo maintained Category 4 strength as it approached Guadalupe with winds of 140 miles per hour on September 17th. The next day, Hugo approached the Virgin Islands at the same intensity. On September 18th, Hugo made 3 landfalls. The first on St. Croix as Category 4 intensity, then at Vieques and Fajardo off the coast of Puerto Rico at Category 3 intensity. Land interaction disrupted the storm circulation and weakened it significantly down to a Category 2 hurricane with winds of 100 miles per hour. By this point, however, Hugo began to increase in speed to 21 miles per hour, up from 10 when it was impacting the Caribbean. It was also turning towards the west-northwest instead of northwest, putting South Carolina in the line of fire. Hugo reorganized, and the eye became better defined. As Hugo approached South Carolina, Governor Carroll Campbell declared a state of emergency, and evacuations were ordered for much of the coast of South Carolina as Hugo approached the area. Hugo was on a direct path to Charleston, the largest city on the South Carolina coast and well known for its history dating back to the 13 colonies and Civil War. To make matters worse, Hugo entered the Gulf Stream, and with the warm water, it allowed it to begin a robust period of intensification as it approached South Carolina. Hugo became a major hurricane on September 21st, and then a Category 4 hurricane that day as the outer bands were beginning to affect South Carolina. The eye also grew to a very large, 40-mile diameter as it barreled down on Charleston and the surrounding communities on September 21st, 1989, at 11 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Major Hurricane Hugo made landfall as a 140-mile-per-hour Category 4 hurricane on Sullivan's Island near Charleston. Charleston got caught in the eyeball and bared the worst of the storm. A storm surge of 20 feet pounded much of South Carolina as Hugo came ashore at a very fast pace. Due to this fast pace, Hugo's winds were much stronger inland than your typical hurricane, still maintaining major hurricane status over 70 miles inland. Hugo would move over Columbia, South Carolina as a Category 2 hurricane and cause extensive damage to the capital of South Carolina. However, as Hugo moved inland, the Appalachian Mountains began to disrupt the circulation, and it weakened down to a tropical storm just west of Charlotte, North Carolina. It then became extratropical and would move through Canada as a powerful system, but the fabric was tearing apart. And on September 25th, Hugo dissipated after causing hell for much of the Lesser Antilles in America, as the culture and prosperity of the 1980s was broken. The damage across the Caribbean was catastrophic for Guadeloupe, as Hugo moved over Point Porte, Guadeloupe's largest city, and it was destroyed and entire areas of agriculture with it due to the winds and the storm surge. Debris also blocked 70% of the roads, making help much more difficult. In total, 11 people were killed, and the damages were totaled at $880 million. In the Virgin Island, St. Croix especially was hit hard by Hugo. Wind gusts of 168 miles per hour were recorded, and the damage associated was catastrophic. St. Thomas was not much better, reaching sustained winds of 121 miles per hour on the island and caused major damage to the electrical grid. WBNB TV's antenna, tower, and transmitter were destroyed, and the station would never return. In total, 3 people were killed and over $500 million of damage was caused. Puerto Rico was hit hard by Hugo, especially at the islands of Vieques and Fajardo. Storm surge of 20 feet was recorded, and the angle of attack was perfect for such a high surge. Wind gusts of up to 180 miles per hour and rainfall associated with Hugo caused flash flooding for parts of the eastern Puerto Rico. In total, 8 people were killed, 6 of which were in Guayama, and over $2 billion in damages occurred. In South Carolina, the level of destruction was damning and absolute. Charleston was hit hard by the eyeball of Hugo as Sullivan's Island was just miles away from this historic major city and Fort Sumter. Hugo's eye was 40 miles wide by this point, and the hurricane pushed over 20 feet of storm surge onto South Carolina's coast. Nearly the whole state suffered some sort of damage, from minor in Greenville to catastrophic in Charleston. On my trip to Charleston in March of 2022, I asked a tour guide how Charleston was affected by Hugo. He told me it was both the worst and best thing that happened to Charleston. The worst because of how much destruction there was, but the best because we were able to get a lot of federal money to rebuild Charleston. That money also helped us restore many historical areas in the city that would now thrive due to the money we received. Governor Carroll Campbell was praised for how he handled the aftermath of Hugo, quickly sending National Guard troops to assess and rescue many people in the Charleston area, and had state and federal funds allocated into repairing the state in a way that was much quicker than many other areas that might have been affected. In total, 21 people were killed in South Carolina, and over $7 billion was caused in damages. However, Hugo set a precedent that would be replicated nearly 3 years later. It intensified up to landfall in South Carolina, something that was relatively rare back then, but would increase in frequency as the years went on. Another thing Hugo did was it completely shattered the good times of the 1980s in America. The culture and prosperity that dominated America in that decade was swept away when Hugo came ashore and caused catastrophic damage to the major and historical cities. South Carolina would recover from this, but American culture was shattered and the economy took a hit due to less tourism in the Charleston and the amount of money it took to rebuild South Carolina. However, this disaster was only the prelude to something much larger and more devastating, but that is a documentary for another time. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more documentaries, and comment down below what your thoughts are on this historic storm. With that being said, have a wonderful day. Stay safe.